So let me start by giving you a brief overview of what awaits you today. Our focus for this morning is on rethinking peacebuilding and mediation in an evolving global order. We have 2 hours now for a panel on this topic and a group reflection deep dive where we'll be engaging everyone in discussion. Then, as you know, from 11:30 to 5, you have your workshops running in parallel with a lunch break from 12:30 to 1:30. You should know which workshop you are joining already, and if you are uncertain regarding the room, you will find plans to guide you in your program or on the screens right outside the conference hall that you can always refer to in case of uncertainty. Lunch will be served in the courtyard at 12:30, and after the workshops end tonight at 6, we have a spotlight conversation focusing on Sudan here in the main hall. Dinner will be served at the hotel at 7, but you also have the option of joining a public reception at 7:30, and then a public panel also held here in the main hall at 8. That panel will focus on the impacts of the United States' changing role in a global world order, and it will be held in German, but there is simultaneous translation available, so if the topic is of interest to you, please just join. If you have any questions at any point, feel free to contact one of our team members, of course, and we're always happy to help out. I hope that has given you an overview of what awaits you today and that you're ready to dive in. So as I mentioned earlier, the landscape of peace mediation is evolving. More and more states and more regional actors are facilitating negotiations and diplomatic engagement. And this is reshaping how peacebuilding operates and how it connects to civil society as well. So the focus for this morning, for this panel, is on how peacebuilding practice can adapt to these new realities and continue to contribute to conflict resolution in that new reality. So for this session, I am very happy to introduce your moderator, who will introduce the speakers and guide you through the session. She's a research associate with the Geneva Graduate Institute. She was previously head of conflict resolution here at the Austrian Center for Peace, and she has more than 15 years experience working in peace mediation, so she's the best person to moderate this panel. Please welcome her on stage, Anna Hess.
Can I ask my panelists to please join me and actually get some of the applause, so it's not only for me. Great. Good morning, everyone. I hope this is working, right? Thank you, Damita, for the great introduction and checking on our temperature. It's becoming ever more important. We used to, not tease, but laugh how the people in the UK would start conversations about weather. And now I think we're getting it. Why? It's because we talk about the weather all the time right now. So, good morning again. Very happy to be here to kickstart the conference or the forum on a topic that is as timely as ever, as challenging and challenged as ever, with a very distinguished panel of experts, practitioners, academics. And I was coming here this morning thinking of two things. First, I wanted to congratulate my ACP colleagues for having, for running this for the 4th year in a row. That's impressive. I was in the beginning of this, and I'm super happy that it has a life on its own and it's becoming a nice tradition, and that it also attracts a lot of attention from great people, great audience like you. So why are we here? What are we going to do in the next 2 hours? Today's the panel is going to be the same, but also a bit different. The first hour we're going to spend having a conversation with our panelists, among the panelists. And then the second hour is going to be about you, and you're going to get the chance to ask your Q&A, to do your Q&A at in a so-called World Cafe format. Outside, or 2 tables here, 2 outside. You'll be told what to do. I don't have to spend time on this. Now, what are we going to talk about? As I said, it's a challenging topic at a time of, raging wars, escalating left and right, hybrid wars, I don't know, from Sudan to Palestine, from Iran to Lebanon to Ukraine. I don't know how many contexts we are suffering, right? And to talk about conflict resolution at a time of raging war is really a tough challenge. and especially when it comes to peace building. But before we go into the peace building challenges of today, I want to sort of set the frame. Where does everything happen, right? Like all of these wars and more that I mentioned have a certain impact, have a big impact on the peace and security architecture all over the world, right? The war in Ukraine has a strong impact on the peace and security architecture in Europe, and I can go on. And we're facing serious challenges to peace and security architecture as we speak. Now, what then these changes mean? I mean, what kind of changes? You all know, I don't have to repeat it, but, you know, we're dealing with increasing geopolitical contestation. We're we're dealing with fragmentation of actors involved, internationalization of conflicts, interstate conflicts, right? Post-Cold War, we had more civil wars, and now we have a mix of everything. And we have a proliferation of actors also on the mediation front. I'll come to that. But then all of these changes and securitization, actually, of peace, if you will, then what does that mean for the efforts to deal with these conflicts, for mediation efforts and for peace building efforts? Now, when it comes to mediation on track one, you know, I don't know our audience well, but most of us who are in the field, we do talk about the changes in the mediation landscape and what are these changes. We're talking about sort of the paralysis or the challenges of the peace mediation that we have been practicing embedded in peace, a liberal peace paradigm that is being challenged, right? That is facing serious issues because there is a serious crisis of multilateralism and norms-driven mediation, and UN norms-driven mediation is facing these challenges in the context that I just described. And then we see paralysis, and I'm using paralysis on purpose, but to be a little bit thought-provoking, because we're here to think with each other, right? And on the other hand, we have actually proliferation or plethora of diverse state actors who are interested in mediation. And they do different kind of mediation than when I say we, I'm talking from the Swiss, Austrian, European mediation community, right? Or the UN mediation sort of approaches and thinking. So there is a plethora of actors doing mediation their way. And what does that mean? Some people call it transactional. I personally, as a scholar, practitioner, I'm still careful labeling them because I'm studying it, and I would encourage all of us to actually understand, study before we label people or state actors. But to come down to our panel and to stop talking. So what does this mean? Basically, these actors, the state actors, and I'm talking about Qatar, and I'm talking about Turkey, and I'm talking about China, South Africa, if you will, Saudi, Emirates, and Pakistan recently. How do they do mediation? Why do they do it? And what does that mean? One thing that I can say as a last point on this one, from the preliminary understanding analysis, we see that these actors, when they come into a conflict context where they try to create mediation spaces, they actually do not have the ultimate objective of transforming societies and democratizing societies so that you can get to peace, right? It's a very issue-based mediation. Turkey mediated the grain deal at a time of raging war between Ukraine and Russia, just a very issue-specific short-term deal, right? That was mediated by Turkey with UN support, of course. Qatar mediated bring the kids back, the kidnapped kids back from Russia, Ukrainian kids, right? Issue-based. It was not aiming at comprehensive peace agreement. Now, I want all of us to think, like, what does that mean then for peace building, right? Peace building on a societal level, on civil society level. And for that, I have the pleasure of introducing you to my great panelists. One thing, I am not going to do justice to their extensive bios, impressive bios, and I'm asking you to read it online. In the booklet, it's there. But I will just say two words about two sentences, because I know if it's too long, it's taking too much time. If it's too short, it doesn't do justice to your great experience. So, who do we have? We're going to kickstart the conversation with Peter Jones, who is a full professor at the University of Ottawa and executive director of the Ottawa Dialogue. He has been convening track 2 and track 1.5 dialogues around the world. For those of you who don't know track 1, track 2, track 1 is basically peace mediation at state level. 1.5 is former officials in their personal capacities, and 2 is civil society peacebuilding, so that you know. Peter has spent, before coming to academia, he has spent 14 years in the Canadian civil service, working on arms control, negotiations, mediation, and related diplomatic functions. Welcome, Peter. Then we have Itonde Kakoma, who is president and CEO of Interpeace. He has held senior roles in humanitarian diplomacy and peace mediation. He has had the luck, if I can say so, Itonde, for working with 3 different presidents, right, on mediation, President Coulter, President Ahtisaari, and I am messing up his name always, forgive me, help me, Tanzanian.
Well, supporting the facilitation efforts of former President Kappa post 2015 electoral disputes in Burundi.
Welcome, Itonde.
Thank you.
Then I have the pleasure of introducing Chris Coulter, who is the Executive Director of Berghof Foundation. Chris brings more than 2 decades of experience in conflict resolution, mediation, peace processes, inclusive leadership, security policy, with prior roles at the Negotiation Strategies Institute, the Folke Bernadotte Academy, and the Swedish Ministry for Foreign Affairs. Welcome, Chris. And I have the pleasure of introducing Imad Karam, who is a Palestinian-born peace activist, dialogue facilitator, executive leader, and filmmaker, focusing on reconciliation, forgiveness, and cross-cultural understanding using real stories and films to encourage empathy, dialogue, and conflict transformation. So, with that, welcome, Imad. I'm going to start the conversation with Peter, and Peter, please tell us, in the context that I just described, how much space there is for track 2 or civil society peace building, and what are the implications of the changes on the field. Maybe you take a little bit of recourse to the past. Please, you have 5 minutes.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you. Thank you for the invitation to this very warm place. My obligatory weather comment is that I was in Bangkok last week facilitating a dialogue, and it was cooler there than it is here. So I thought I would begin by spending a few minutes on a little bit of history. One of the things I do in my sort of scholarly hat is looking at the history of this field and where did it come from and how did it grow. And so when we talk about track 2 or track 1.5 or now track 3, all these ideas of tracks, it really, as in the field as we understand it, began in the 1960s with work by men like John Burton, Herbert Kelman, Christopher Mitchell, others, through the 60s and 70s to create this idea that there is a role for a non-official level, as it were, in peace mediation. And these men, and they were all men at that time, were very put off by the transactional, power-centric, realist nature of official diplomacy. And they felt that if you could get people in conflicts, people of influence, but not necessarily officials, into a room and begin talking about some of the underlying dynamics and the psychological factors, you could explore a conflict in different ways and come up with different solutions. But they were very much motivated, and they admitted at the time, by the belief that their objective was to create new ideas and put them onto the official track to support official peacemaking. And so that was really the way they began it. And then over the 70s and the 80s, we began getting people thinking about, well, what is the role of broader civil society? Not these elite track 1.5 former officials, but broader civil society groups in this. And so you begin to have people like Diamond and MacDonald talking about multi-track diplomacy, and Saunders talking about circumnegotiation. And they were talking about an idea of channeling civil society into support for these peace processes. But they were still talking about the idea that ultimately the work was to support track 1, the idea that peace is made at the track 1 level. And it's not really until the end of the Cold War and the Secretary General's agenda for peace and things like that, that we begin to see a sort of a change in the nature of people thinking about what civil society mediation is. And the role of civil society in not just helping track 1 to make peace, but in beginning to transform conflicts. And in beginning the idea of mediation in the service of supporting norms and values and promoting norms and values. So mediation more and more as advocacy at the sort of track 3 level. And so I think where we are now, a very, very lot of history in a very compressed space, is that you still have track 1.5, and some track 2 going on, this sort of quiet dialogues amongst influential elites. But more and more, what we see at the track 3 space is about advocacy. And very often, to some extent, it's in, I wouldn't say competition, but to some extent contradiction with what's going on at track 1. It's pushing a different agenda. And so the question, I think, for the field is how can we harness and begin to bring back all this track 3 civil society advocacy work into support of track 1. And this is particularly acute, I think, if we have states like Qatar and Saudi and Pakistan who are now getting into the mediation space, and they're very much old-style, realist, transactional. How does civil society support that? And so there's some work emerging just in the last year or two that's quite exciting. There's an idea called patchwork peacemaking, which I've been involved a little bit in, but others have been leading the charge. There's Mark Barrow's work on people who span the boundaries of the tracks. There's someone named Aleem Barwani who's talking about people who create relationships between the tracks. And all this work, it's all very embryonic, but it really speaks to the idea that when we conceive of a peace process and a multi-track process with all these different tracks working, we have to begin thinking about the idea that there should be individuals whose job it is to try to bring the tracks together, or to try to at least suggest specific areas in which the work done on one track can support the other. They're not going to all come together and work together. That's not going to happen. The whole multi-track idea of Diamond and MacDonald years ago, that there could be this holistic peace process, it's not going to happen. But there could be things that could be done at different levels. And so that, I think, is where the field is going. And it's quite exciting. Thank you.
That you're saying it's exciting, because a lot of us are overwhelmed and we find it like we had a conversation today, but exciting, absolutely. I want to pick up on what you said about, I mean, it's fascinating. Maybe, no, I shouldn't talk. We should go to Itonde right now and see your experience and your thoughts on the dilemmas and the challenges of the peace building at large today.
Thank you, Anna and Peter, for this very fine summation of the evolution of things. If I could build off of some elements that you alluded to as a part of conversation, and a word of appreciation to our hosts here. Thank you very much for the invitation. On the history, it's a question and observation. Are we fair to the history of peacemaking, peace building, to have as our point of departure, for example, in the case of the institution I'm privileged to lead, 30 years ago, in the context of a post-Cold War order, or 60 years ago, as you described, in terms of the theoretical underpinnings of how certain conceptualizations around tracks, for example, have emerged. But are we fair to ourselves in this regard? Because one could argue that many of the elements described, the role of formal and particularly informal actors, have been and will continue to be a part of the human story in terms of how we advance dialogue. I have a preoccupation, not just because of where I reside in Geneva, seeing the historical, architectural forms of earlier periods of multilateralism in terms of League of Nations, and contemplating what its demise means for the current time without being entirely ahistorical about it. But when you look at that period, some 40 years prior to our initial point of departure, the role of non-formal, informal, independent institutions and individuals is part and parcel of giving rise to ideas for international cooperation in the peaceful settlement of disputes. Integrated. And I think that's fundamental to how we have evolved, frankly, as humans, not to be entirely too broad about it. I think the particular period where we have our dilemmas is on institutionalization of that evolution. So, in Anna's very generous introduction, she referred to individuals, when in fact I know those individuals would refer to their institutions, their organizations, like the Carter Center, like CMI, in which the characteristics of their own experience, values, relationships, networks, found themselves embodied in the professionalization, if you will, for the long term. And I think where we're struggling at the moment is how the institutionalization, the professionalization of best practice, as you so well described, is confronted by other types of compounding challenges. For me, central to this, the very notion of why we come into existence as an organization, which links to why many others around a similar period come into existence. The precisely responding to Boutros Boutros-Ghali's agenda for peace, where the system post-Cold War was not able to grapple with the new types of challenges then, requiring, let's say, other ways of grappling with widespread armed conflict beyond great power competition. The challenge for us now is that states, tied to the systems we have been complementing, no longer enjoy a monopoly of power. They don't enjoy a monopoly of power in terms of diplomacy, and thus in peacemaking. They don't enjoy a monopoly of power in terms of economy, communications, or technology. So as we think ahead, it's also about what does complementarity look like in a world in which that monopolization or concentration of power, even if you still have powerful states, but they themselves are grappling with what this rise of others means, challenging that power. And here I would contend that in the last half a century plus, at least in terms of the agreements I've been privileged to review, I'd be hard-pressed to identify any of them that isn't transactional in some form in nature. Mm-hmm. It's part and parcel of quote-unquote negotiations. Now the question is whether, and this is the transformative piece, whether there is the wherewithal, the forward-thinkingness, the ability to imagine something beyond the immediacy of a transaction that may bring an end to suffering. That's important. But is there the ability to move beyond that? That's the question mark. But at its core, I think we're hard-pressed to identify any agreement that isn't transactional in nature. And here, I would urge us, if there's one thing that I would really urge, is that we reject this idea that the era of the comprehensive peace agreement is over. I flatly reject it. Why? Because in accepting it, we remove the possibility of imagining something larger. It's not to say that the blueprint, if you will, for comprehensive peace settlements is the end-all be-all, but the notion of what is comprehensive, beyond exclusive elite interest, towards a transformative agenda, that's central. With one final observation of where you left off, is where we begin, and I'm sure others begin as an institution. Our very notion at the core, and you described it so far better than I could, is precisely the interconnectedness of processes. With humility, you won't be able to find a peaceful resolution to the situation in Syria if you don't appreciate the neighborliness of sectarian identity in relationship to state building in a geopolitical context. Mm-hmm. You won't find a transformative solution in Eastern DRC if we don't understand how the global economy directly impacts individuals who are taking up arms and illicit trading and how these interact. So what you describe is part and parcel, not just of the future, but of best practice. So in a sense, we're going back to basics rather than doing something new. Thank you.
Thank you, Itonde. I have the ungrateful job of being a moderator and cutting off. But very important points on the institutionalization and also the monopoly of power. I hope we can have a moment to unpack that a little bit in the next round when we talk about what can be adapted and sort of opportunities to go ahead, to move forward. But I love the idea of imagining the big piece. I think it's good to be reminded of that. Chris, I want to come to you. Thank you for that. I want to come to you and see from your experience, institutional perspective, what these changes mean. How do you see, the challenges? And we'll move on to opportunities in a bit. But what are the dilemmas that you're facing right now?
Well, thank you for that. And thank you, Itonde, for when you said a comprehensive peace agreement, I think that's the issue. I don't think it's an A. It's not A. It's the fragmentation of that. But thank you for the hope piece. Anna, thank you. Thank you also to our host for inviting us. Fascinating and very timely conversation. I don't think we're seeing the death of value-based mediation. I really don't. But I do think we need to be critical and self-reflect on the Eurocentricity, I'm going to call it that for now, of how we've been doing things. We were seeing the emergence of many different actors, and you all listed them, most of them. And they're here to stay, I think. The plurality of the mediation field is here. And it's not about policing this area. We're not that's not our job to police it. Who gets to do what? But we also have to be honest that the norms and values, international order that we have believed in and preached for a long time has been very selective, to say the least. And I mean, to be honest about that. But does that mean that we give them up or we throw them out? No, I don't think so. But on the what are the different actors' different roles? So you mentioned Qatar, for instance. They are interesting because, as they say themselves, they are fast, they're flexible, they have money, they talk to everyone. As opposed to many European and global North, I don't like the word, but you know what I mean, that we have sanctioned ourselves against talking to certain individuals, certain actors. And you've been in the field a long time, also, Anna, and as have all of you. We're supposed to talk to everyone, also the conflict parties. How will you resolve these conflicts otherwise? But Qatar realizes also they don't have a very long footprint in certain contexts. For instance, they're now reaching out actively to European countries, Norway, Switzerland, to do it together. Because on the Colombia file that they've been working on, they don't know Colombia, but the Norwegians actually do. Mm-hmm. So I think if you see, I see more collaboration, coordination, and cooperation, and I think that's the key. We're still very bad at it. Look at Sudan. They're more mediators than they're conflict parties in Sudan. How do you make sense of that, and whose role is doing what? On Peter's, and thank you for that, Peter. I think it's important to look back and to see that this transactionalism is not new. My problem with deal making is that it's very short term. Of course, you can negotiate a trade deal that is long term, but in terms of conflict transformation, but it has some good aspects, and it's here to stay, so it's what we have to work with. So it can end violence, cessation of hostilities, ceasefires, even if many of them are also broken. So it can achieve certain things, but there are for sure things it cannot achieve. And that is what Itonde also said, sort of the transformation of societies. And that's where track 2, track 3 play a really important role. But of course, we're in this geopolitical context, and you mentioned it yourself, Anna, deterrence and defense. So while we're simultaneously seeing an increase in spending on deterrence and defense, we're seeing a simultaneous parallel defunding of our sector. And that worries me, not just so much for selfish reasons, but it's part of the toolbox. Why don't we use all the tools we have to prevent or end or transform conflicts? And soft diplomacy plays a key role. And if you can't talk at state level, and I just wanted to add to Peter also, one of the things with track 1.5, 2, is that if they are not ready, you can pull it down to the more unofficial level to nurture that space, to enable those conversations to happen where the deal making takes place. And that needs investment. It takes time, so it needs patience. And we live in a very impatient world. And I'm so happy, Anna, you said you're doing research on this, because the speed with which things are happening, and also with the what role will AI play now also in our world? And the big institutions like the UN, the smaller institutions, and down to NGOs such as my own. But in a few years back, it will be so interesting to see, what happened. What happened and what were the effects. I just want to say again that I think, and I mentioned it before, so what I'm looking for now is courageous coalitions and better coordination because of this fragmentation. Just at least, we don't have to have a comprehensive peace agreement, but let's at least sort of try to share an understanding of where we're going and what role each and one of us can play. So Qatar can play a role, Pakistan can play a role, Interpeace can play a role, but to get a better grip on that.
Definitely. Thank you so much, Chris. I think it's absolutely another inspirational point to focus on the CCC, right? The triple C, the coordination, cooperation, and...
My initials, by the way, just say.
Your initials. Okay, nice. And I couldn't help but sort of pick up on the idea that what you said, Itonde, transact and transform, and it doesn't have to actually, exclude each other. And funding, extremely important, big elephant in the room. We hardly ever talk about it because it's not attractive, but it's extremely important. Now, I want to move, and many other points that I would love to pick up, but later. Imad, I want to come to you and see your perspective. Let us share with us your perspective on the changing field, on the, narrowing spaces for dialogue, but still the extreme importance, increasing importance for it, and how do you see the challenges before we move on to the opportunities?
Thank you, Anna. Good morning. Can you hear me? Sabah al-khair. It's difficult really to follow from my three co-panelists here. I am sitting and thinking, what can I say that would sound useful or interesting or important? But the fundamental thought is that we need to be real. What do I mean by that? I think Chris spoke mostly for me, the Eurocentric approach, the post-World War, Cold War actually, paradigm, and the European-centered approach for peace building, which if you look at it, it's actually ideal. It's good. But we haven't asked ourselves if it has been implemented. And that's where the issue is. We are discussing the geopolitical changes because suddenly we're talking about Pakistan being a mediator. I mean, that is, head moving. But we haven't asked ourselves, why have we failed in delivering peace? I was sitting on the plane from London to here and thinking as a little child growing up in Gaza, I used to go with my uncle from the Gaza Sea, having collected some fish, to sell it in Israel, a journey of 1 hour, finish off the sales and come back. No borders, no issues. That was when Gaza was directly occupied by Israel. That's about 50 years ago for me. 10 years later, we threw stones at the Israelis. They threw back gas tear bombs and rubber-coated bullets. Just going to take a long time, so I'm going to cut it short. A little bit later, in 2000, we were shot at by Israelis with bullets, live bullets, killing directly. Now we're talking about the genocide. And just before that, we talked about tanks coming in 2009. Am I too loud? Oh, I'm sorry. Is this better? Thank you. So coming back to my point, we've had the Oslo Peace Agreement, 1993 was it? Where is the peace building? Where is the institutions we're talking about? Where have they been since and what happened? Where is that self-reflection on ourselves as peacemakers? Now, the issue, and I think Chris alluded to it, is that agreements can be reached, and they have been. MOUs, we've just now talking about an MOU between the United States and Iran. So that's mediation, so that's track one, right? But track two in civil society is the patient work. Let's come down again. Is the patient work, is the long-term work. And none of us, I am generalizing, as NGOs, as peace builders, have got the time or the resources to engage in the transformative that we talked about. Peace is not just an agreement, it's relationships being transformed. When relationships change, the situation changes. Track one talks about the issues, reaches an agreement. It's about the powerful. The powerful decide. So again, if we look back at us as peacemakers, and I am talking about the European model here, we have serious questions on inclusion, local ownership. We have serious questions on impact. We're driven by money. We follow the money. We measure our work. I'm talking about the work I've been leading, based on how many workshops have we done, how many people we have trained, how many meetings, and how many interventions. But we almost never talk about and measure the transformative relationships between whichever warring parties there are. Has trust increased? Has relationships changed? These are the questions we don't often try to answer. We don't look forward as well to creating the next generation of peace builders. What would that look like? So in conclusion, Anna, the landscape for mediation is changing. The globe, the world is changing. I mean, we haven't talked about, and I take it seriously, while I want to up the point on institutions and how important, because institutions last and they carry the legacy and all the learnings. But we do live in the world today where institutions have been, what's the word in English? Undermined, right? We talk about the board of peace for the Middle East. Look at who's on it. It's a simple, look at how the United Nations, instead of being fixed, is being trashed aside. Look at international law. So anyway, I think we can look at some answers, but the civil society is relevant. Peace building is relevant, is needed, even if the actors change, states' interventions changes. But it is more important than actually ever in this changing environment that we review and resource the peace builders and civil society organizations and initiatives. And I'll finish with this. And I was asking this, I think, yesterday at the dinner table. What will we do differently? We can't just continue business as usual.
Right.
So that's the central question for us.
Thank you, Imad. That's a great segue to actually back to Peter. If I can just throw in one element which you already started. Our premise here was that it's the context that is changing, and the tool that we're using is actually the right one. Right? So it's good that you're making us challenge. Is actually dialogue the right tool? Because we don't seem to be challenging that. We assume that, or we believe that dialogue is the way to go. It's just the context that has changed, and now we have to find a space to do more of the same. But as you said, and you used the very strong words, rightfully so, that we have failed to do that. So I would like us to also challenge that. But Peter, and one thing that I want to sort of throw into the discussion before you use your next 3 minutes to walk us through. I'm sorry. Yes, it is. You talked about sort of connecting the tracks. It was a very interesting trajectory you gave us, back to basics, but the constant need to connect the tracks. Right now, the tracks are, really disconnected. And I'm wondering, do we actually need to connect the tracks? If the track one is paralyzing or paralyzed, and track two can open spaces and, as Chris said, generate ideas, the boil all of this stuff, independent, informal spaces, do we have to actually connect or not? So I'd like you to touch upon that as well. And what do we keep, what do we throw?
Yeah, very, very fundamental questions. I think that we do. whether we have to connect them the way that we thought about connecting them for the last 60 or 80 years is a question. But I mean, at the end of the day, governments make deals, and they have the capacity, they have the guns. They're not the only ones with guns anymore, but they do have the majority of the guns. And if they're going to fall silent and allow other things to begin to happen, they have to be part of this. And so I think it is important to connect the tracks, but I think we have to think hard about how and why. And the sort of implicit assumption from the earlier period of this multi-track work that this organic connection between the tracks would emerge from hard work and thinking and discussion and so on is no longer, I think, necessarily the case. And so what I find very interesting right now is kind of, what's the next version of multi-track diplomacy? And how does that work? And here I think I come back to these ideas that are beginning to sort of emerge: patchwork peacemaking, boundary spanning, relationship building between the tracks. And, my sort of small contribution to the special edition on the patchwork peacemaking idea was to try to imagine who does this and how do they do it. Because the idea of patchwork peacemaking is that if you think of a peace process not as a sort of a pyramid like Lederach did and all that, but as a quilt, the thing you lay on your bed. And it's made up of many different patches of cloth, right? And each of those patches is quite different and doing a different thing. But somehow they all have to be sewn together to form a quilt. And so who does that? Who creates the patchwork? And so these patchers would, I think, be people who have experience at the different tracks. Their life experience has led them into the different tracks. They have connections and they have the trust of the different tracks. And they will spend most of their time within a peace process not necessarily interacting between the two protagonists in the field, but between the different organizations and nations that are doing the mediating. That will be their function, is to sort of bring that together. And I think that as we start conceiving of what a peace process is and process design and all that, we have to start thinking about who's going to do the patching, who's going to span the boundaries, and what role do they have within the peace process, and how much do they need to interact with the parties in the conflict, or how much are they just about doing the patchworking? And I don't have any answers to these questions yet. I think it's going to be trial and error. Right. But I sort of think that's where the field is going.
Interesting. Yeah. Thank you so much. It's great since we are here and we started the conversation yesterday with art. The art of peace, but peace as peacemaking is art. And I think
we're making quilts.
Sorry?
Now we're making quilts.
Exactly, yeah. So imagine the collages, and I think it's an extremely important one. Should there be a centralized institution or a person to do that, or can actually peace builders learn to do patchworking themselves?
One thing, if I could add just 15 seconds.
Sure.
One of the problems for the field, and particularly the scholarly side of the field, will be that this is almost impossible to model. A lot of the early writing on peace building and tracks was all about models. How do you create a model? This is going to be serendipity. It's going to be individuals. It's not entirely serendipity because there'll have to be some thought given to a place within a structure for these people. But it's more about the personal qualities of the individuals than about the model.
Right.
And I think scholars are going to find that rather hard. Practitioners, not so much.
Right, from individual to institutions and back. Itonde, I want to come to you and Interpeace, particularly from, you're heading that an important NGO. And are you challenging the utility of dialogue as a tool, or you're trying to adapt to the context, believing in the tool as the right way to go? And in that, sort of, with that, what is it that you are trying to adapt to? Or how are you trying to adapt to the new reality? Are you basically challenging the tool, the way you're doing peace building, as doing dialogues, or are you thinking of new tools instead of trying to adapt to the context?
Adaptation is natural. Mm-hmm. If we don't adapt, we're static, and it speaks to irrelevance. However, at the same time, we are fundamentally an institution that not just believes in dialogue, but whose entire basis rests on the importance of dialogue. So if this is no longer useful, then what are we doing? The forms in which dialogue occurs is something else. I think perhaps even more fundamentally for us and sister institutions, not just within the peacebuilding sector, but more broadly, is a fundamental question around what does it mean to be an international civil society that is independent? And the stress on independence is crucial at this moment we're in, precisely because of how long-standing trusted partnerships by states are more subject to political winds, tied to how policies and funding is determined. And I think the threat is that you have a quote-unquote independent civil society that hasn't been so independent. And our stress now is, what does independence look like? That's where you find your complementarity, your quote-unquote usefulness in the geopolitical realm in which we are in. And I would add that, why not Pakistan? Why not? Meaning, not because I'm advocating for them, no. And not because they don't have competing interests. Or in fact, at the same time of taking on that role, active hostilities with neighbors. But there are numerous other examples of Western states with the precise same dilemmas. And we don't ask the question, or we do, but accept it. And fundamental to the role of a mediator is acceptance by parties. And I think here also history plays a part. Pakistan in the Cold War period, for example, was crucial in terms of providing, through a non-aligned arrangement, providing counsel to past secretary generals, particularly in terms of navigating space. And many of those relations have held. If I could add comprehensive agreements, if we look at, say, for example, the 2005 Comprehensive Peace Agreement between the government of Sudan and that of the Sudan People's Liberation Army movement, it is a patchwork. It is not a one-off thing. It's the culmination of multiple agreements. And when you study it, you see precisely that, patchwork, from multiple different periods. And in fact, building off of earlier periods, including a ceasefire negotiated by former President Carter on Guinea worm, which creates conditions some 7 years later for the likes of General Sembeo to now start putting patchworks together. And what's fascinating about that period is you still have Kenya was an interested party, actively supporting the SPLA, but found itself able in this kind of framework to be sufficiently enabled by a conflicting party, namely Sudan, to still play its role. I think there are lessons in that for how we see more explicit interest-based forms of mediation now. The difference is you had robust multilateral structures undergirding that, but we weren't short of interest or direct support to conflicting parties.
Thank you, Itonde. Chris, I want to come back to who should do the patchworking, and if you see Berghof as an institution. I mean, I'm putting you on the spot, but you represent the community. Whether you think that we should be an institution, and how can we integrate sort of the patchworking into our work? But I want you to give us your sort of wisdom, last insight on what should be adapted, how we should adapt our approach to peace building. I challenged dialogue. I know it's an uncomfortable challenge, but I do think about this all the time, because there's dialogue fatigue, right? In many contexts, we have been doing this. And anyway, but back to you, Chris.
Who should do the patchworking?
Right, who should do the patchworking?
I mean, I really want to thank Peter for raising it. And I am familiar with that work with your colleagues. And I have to say, I really love it. And it really gives hope. So who does patchworking traditionally? Women. women do quilts. I'm sure there are some men who do quilts, but traditionally. And this brings a totally new energy. We're also seeing the emergence, such as myself, of women also taking up leadership in European peacebuilding organizations. That hasn't been the case before. We're also seeing it globally in a time when this deal-making that we're seeing, receiving fewer women. I know Meloni was in Riyadh, but she wasn't in the picture. There were only men in that first picture when Trump brought everyone together for Gaza. There are a few women on the board of peace, but I hear they never meet, so I don't know what they talk about. No, but I don't think it's an institution, Anna. I don't. I mean, we have to protect the UN with everything we have, but the UN also needs to shape up. Like, why did it take so long for them to appoint an envoy for the conflict with Iran, Israel, and the US? The thing with the deal making also, like, how do we counter, like, how do we fit in with that? We're mainly talking about 3 wars, right? We're talking about Russia, Ukraine, Gaza, now Lebanon, and Sudan. Those are the 3 big wars we're talking about. And they have not ended, so we don't know if this deal-making is going to work or not. Meanwhile, every day there are conflicts in so many other contexts which we don't talk about, and many of them we work in. And every day dialogues are happening about access to water, about governance. We support the process in Yemen, which has been going on and on forever. But you can work with the governorates on getting people clean water. You can work on upstreams, downstreams conflict in Iraq. You can work on a lot on climate, I would say. Climate is a good entry point. You can't talk to Taliban about girls' education just yet, but you can talk to them about climate. And that's an entry point. And maybe it could give other things. But I do think it's this networking, it's what John Paul Lederach would say, to swarm the system. So we all need to be like a bee swarm. And you know how they operate. There's like some intuitive, collective movement there.
Right, right. Well, that's a beautiful image, swarming. Thank you so much, Chris. Imad, I want to come to you. And Chris said beautifully, like, you know, this doesn't work, the bigger questions don't work, but you can find access through community issues that are very, very, like, immediately touching people. But I want to come to you and give us, I mean, and yeah, I know this is a big ask, right? But how do you keep faith in doing dialogue at a time that we described, and from your experience in your context, and when you said we have to be realistic and we have failed, how do you keep faith in this? How do you do your work, on reconciliation through dialogue, you know, in these challenging times? Yeah, I know it's a huge ask.
Yeah, that's a really big question, Anna. Our minds want a quick fix. We are fixated on quick solution, a quick fix. So it's almost wrong to expect and to ask of dialogue and reconciliation when a genocide is happening. I remember at the beginning of 2022, I had to calm my colleagues down because they were annoyed that our Ukrainian friends refused for us to host a conversation with Russians. They said, how dare you even suggest it? This was before Gaza kicked off. So now, years on, what I would say is this. Peace, again, peace building work is painstaking, is long-term, is deep, is difficult. Regardless of which context we're talking about. Where is the space? We talked about transformed relationships. Where is the space when historical trauma will be addressed? Where is the space when collective fear would be talked about? Where is the space where narratives of victimhood will be talked about? And my final point here is experiences of injustice. So we shouldn't look at dialogue, maybe find another term, where it's about sorting out the problem, coming to a peace deal or a peaceful solution. We need the conversation, the space, the encounter, where those 4 things I just mentioned and I've written down can be touched on. Historical trauma, narratives of memory, identity, It's not just about land and economic benefits and repression and linguistic and cultural identity. It's the deep, it's the historical. Fear. And it's a very powerful driving force. Fear. Victimhood. Whether real or perceived, victimhood is quite significant. And injustice. So we must maintain faith. I say it against every cell of my body that says, are you crazy? You know, but I want to believe in a better tomorrow, in a better future. And I do not want to give up to genocidal maniacs and crazy people anywhere who want to hijack the world and the future. So our task is really tougher than ever. We need to speak up. I'll finish with this, and I know time is short. But one of my biggest frustration in us is what I call neutrality. Because we feel handcuffed. We can't speak up. We see something wrong, and we say, we're going to lose our trust. They're not going to want us to intervene. And we must find a way to deal with it. So how can we maintain our principles of no harm and speak up without losing the legitimacy to be a broker? And I think we might have a response here. No?
May I? He's inviting me. May I?
I am. But she's in
I
charge.
have promised not to go overboard, but can I invite you,
Just
very
very
briefly?
briefly?
Okay, very briefly, please.
You know,
Yeah.
Thank you. Deeply, particularly on the historical trauma.
Yeah.
As Chris indicated, the vast majority of conflicts we see now are intergenerational in scope and nature. They're not new. And that has everything to do with what you said. On neutrality, this is fundamental, and we have lessons here. There's a distinction between the application of neutrality and humanitarian diplomacy. We need to protect that space versus peace mediation. And I would lean on the likes of President Altazari. I see colleagues from CMI who spoke of being an honest broker, or President Carter, who understood that there was no distinction between engaging with individuals for alleged war crimes and advocating for the establishment and upholding of international criminal law. There are no contradictions.
They shouldn't be.
Precisely from the point of view as you described. This is not a neutral proposition.
Yeah.
It's a values-based proposition that doesn't block but enables engagement, including with those you are vehemently opposed to.
Engagement is not endorsement.
Engagement is not endorsement. Chris said it much more simply than I did.
Yeah.
Beautiful.
Thank you.
Agree. Thanks. Yeah.
Thank you, Itonde, for doing my job. Actually, you summarized nicely, so I don't have to do that. Thank you, Imad. Very powerful insights. The need for our work, for track to civil society, peace building, transforming societies, transforming the pain and trauma of people increasingly is there. And I'm super happy to have your, here, to have your insights with us. I'm not going to synthesize more than these people. Let it stay with you. Do with the insights whatever you want to do. You have an hour then to pick on their amazing brains of the four people. And I'm asking Damita to come and walk us through. But before that, please join me in giving a nice round of applause to our panelists.
Thank you. Thank you, Anna. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna, for asking for the applause, so I don't have to do that. All that remains for me to do is to explain what's going to happen next. So instead of doing a full frontal Q&A, we decided to design a World Cafe type format. Anna has alluded to it, but we would like to extend the discussion and to really bring everyone in. So what's going to happen is you will find 4 dialogue tables spread across this room and outside. So as you can see, there are 2 on the ground floor here, 1 in each corner, and then upstairs you will find 2 dialogue tables just outside the room, making 4 in total, 1 for each speaker. So during the next hour, you have the opportunity, 55 minutes, you have the opportunity to engage directly with each of the wonderful panelists and exchange with them, profit from their expertise some more in a smaller group setting. You will have just under 15 minutes for each round, and after this time, we will ask you to move to the next table. So after about 13, 14 minutes, you'll hear a bell. That is your signal that there is 1 minute remaining in the round, and a second bell will indicate that it's time to rotate. So once you hear the bell, basically just move, We encourage you really to ask your questions, bring in your ideas. I noticed that, you probably could have gone on for another hour, so there is a lot still remaining to be said, a lot of questions and thoughts and comments that you can still bring in. So we encourage you to do that. And we have a moderator at each table helping to guide the conversation and ensuring that everyone has an opportunity to contribute. So with that said, I would ask the panelists to spread out. So maybe Itonde and Chris, if you could stay in this room and each pick a table here on the ground floor. And then maybe Imad and Peter, if I can ask you to move upstairs. Just outside the room, you will find your tables. Anna, you are joining me in moderating one of the tables, and Moni and Ozala will also be helping. So for those of you moderating, pick a table, pick a speaker, join them, and please enjoy the World Cafe.